Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. If these reflections speak to something silent inside you, subscribe so you don't lose the path back here. Every like, every comment helps this message find those who are still searching in the dark. Now, let's begin. There is something Carl Jung discovered that most modern psychologists never dare to touch. When an empath finally heals their deepest wound, the people they attract change immediately. Not slowly, not over months, instantly, as if their entire psychological frequency reorganizes itself. And this shift is so dramatic. Jung once described it as terrifying in its implications. Because the empath's core wound is not the wound most people think it is. It is not childhood trauma alone. It is not abandonment. It is not sensitivity gone out of control. The real wound sits much deeper, at the crossroads of perception, identity, and suppression. Jung spent years working with empaths who walked into his office spiritually and emotionally shattered. People who had learned to apologize for existing. People who carried the emotional burden of everyone around them, parents, partners, friends, until their own soul felt like a distant memory. He realized these were not ordinary patients. These were people with a specific psychological architecture, a rare configuration of consciousness he would later call differentiated intuitive perception. They could read micro-expressions without trying. They sensed hidden emotions before words were spoken. They recognized patterns of manipulation, insecurity, or self-betrayal instantly. But here's the tragedy Jung uncovered. Their intelligence was punished. Their perception was rejected. Their clarity was called too sensitive. Their intuition was labeled paranoid. So the empath learned to suppress their greatest gift. To survive, they developed a split within themselves, what Jung called a double consciousness. One part of them sees with piercing clarity. The other part pretends to be blind so relationships don't collapse. This internal fracture becomes the empath's core wound. And this wound determines exactly who they attract. When an empath suppresses their inner truth, they become a magnet for people who need someone spiritually blind to their dysfunction. Manipulators, emotional dependents, and unconscious individuals sense this suppression the way predators sense vulnerability. Not consciously and instinctively. Jung saw this pattern repeat across hundreds of cases. The empath sees the manipulation. The empath feels the dishonesty. The empath detects the patterns. But instead of trusting this perception, they doubt themselves. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe they didn't mean it. This self-betrayal is the empath's first prison. And manipulative people reinforce the bars. You're imagining things. You're too emotional. You misunderstood. Every time the empath sees clearly, someone tells them not to trust themselves. Eventually, the empath begins to apologize for their intelligence. And this is the stage in which they attract the most damaging people. Jung called this repeating loop the victim cycle. The empath attracts someone unconscious or manipulative. The empath sees the pattern. The empath doubts themselves. The manipulator reinforces the doubt. The empath suppresses their intuition to keep the relationship alive. The cycle repeats. This cycle deepens until one moment, a moment Jung said, arrives like lightning. A betrayal so undeniable, so piercing, that the empath can no longer pretend they don't see what they see. It might be infidelity. It might be deceit. It might be a long pattern of exploitation suddenly revealed in full. But the true devastation comes not from what was done to them, but from realizing they saw every warning sign and silenced themselves anyway. And in that moment, the empath awakens. Jung called this the clarity event. Suddenly, the fractured consciousness merges. The part that always knew the truth rises to the surface, fully integrated, fully awake. And what happens next is not anger, not chaos, not emotional collapse. It is silence, it is precision, it is certainty. The empath stops apologizing, stops defending themselves, stops explaining what they feel, stops negotiating with dysfunction, and something in their energy becomes unmistakably different. Jung described it as the emergence of the complete personality. The empath becomes still, and in that stillness, unbreakable. This is shadow integration, not darkness, but the reclaiming of everything the empath was forced to reject. Their intuition, their brilliance, their boundaries, their strength. The empath becomes whole. And the moment this happens, the entire field of people they attract flips overnight. Those who once fed on their doubt can no longer approach them. Those who once manipulated them suddenly feel exposed. Those who once relied on their emotional labor feel the ground shift beneath them. Manipulators instinctively retreat. Authentic people instinctively come closer. Not because the empath changed what they see, but because they finally trust it. Not because they became cold, but because they stopped being porous. Not because they became selfish, but because they stopped betraying themselves. This is the beginning of the empath's sovereignty, and it is only the beginning. Once the empath reaches the clarity event, something extraordinary begins to unfold. Something Jung said was the most dramatic shift in relational psychology. The empath no longer participates in the old unconscious contract. They stop cushioning others from the consequences of their own behavior. They stop absorbing the emotional overflow of people who refuse to regulate themselves. They stop smoothing every conflict, over-explaining every feeling, and rescuing every unstable person who demands it. Jung called this stage the Great Reorientation, the moment when the empath's energy, which had always flowed outward, finally turns inward. This shift is not depression, it is not withdrawal, it is not emotional shutdown. It is the beginning of psychological sovereignty. For the first time, the empath asks, "What do I want? What do I need? Who am I when I'm not carrying everyone else's shadows?" And the world around them reacts instantly. People accustomed to the empath's endless availability feel a sudden, shocking void. The emotional labor they relied upon, the calming presence, the validation, the listening, the understanding, disappears. Not with anger, not with revenge, with absence. This is what Jung called the withdrawal of projections. For years, people projected their emotional burdens onto the empath, assuming the empath would continue absorbing them indefinitely. But when the empath steps back, those projections fall to the floor, leaving others face to face with the parts of themselves they have avoided their entire lives. This is why the empath's quiet shift feels brutal. It forces psychological accountability. Those who once depended on the empath's softness suddenly feel the hardness of their own unhealed wounds. Those who once manipulated through guilt can no longer gain access. Those who once lied feel naked in the presence of someone who now sees with unbroken clarity. Some react with anger, calling the empath selfish. But Jung explained this anger as projection of the rejected shadow, the part of themselves they refuse to confront. Others react with desperation, promising change, offering affection they never showed before. But Jung noted this behavior for what it is, the fear of losing a psychological caretaker, not the desire for true intimacy. Only a small number respond with maturity, by looking inward, taking responsibility and beginning their own individuation. But Jung emphasized that this group is rare, because most people fear the mirror the empath now holds simply by existing. The vacuum effect. Jung coined a term for what happens next, the vacuum effect. When the empath stops filling every emotional gap, the emptiness becomes impossible for others to ignore. Conversations feel different. Power dynamics collapse. Manipulators lose their scripts. Emotional dependents lose their anchor. Narcissists lose their supply. Because the empath's energy was the structure propping up the entire relational system. Once removed, everyone around them must face the truth. I was not relating to you, I was using you. And the empath, now seeing clearly, can no longer engage with people who refuse to grow. This is not punishment, it is evolution. The empath's silence. Jung described the empath's silence as the most potent psychological communication. Silence communicates, I'm no longer participating. I'm no longer available for dysfunction. I'm no longer betraying myself to stay connected to you. To someone unconscious, silence feels like abandonment. To someone manipulative, silence feels like exposure. To someone emotionally mature, silence feels like respect and boundary. But to the empath, silence feels like coming home. It is not the silence of avoidance. It is the silence of integration. A stillness that says, I trust myself now.
The attraction flip.
As this new stability settles in, the shift Jung observed becomes unmistakable. The empath stops attracting wounded predators and begins attracting psychologically mature allies. Before healing, empaths attract people who need them to remain blind. After healing, they attract people who value being seen. This shift is not mystical, it is psychological frequency. When an empath suppresses intuition, their unconscious broadcasts a signal. I will absorb your pain. I will doubt my reality. I will let you lead. But when the empath integrates their shadow, the signal becomes, I see clearly, I trust myself, I choose wisely. Manipulators sense this like animals sense fire. They instinctively retreat. Meanwhile, emotionally honest people feel magnetized. They finally sense someone who can see them without judgment, someone who cannot be manipulated, someone who holds boundaries like sacred ground. The new reality. Jung began documenting long-term outcomes. Empaths who had been chronically exploited suddenly entered stable, reciprocal relationships. Empaths who had been overlooked became leaders, healers, creators. Empaths who once apologized for existing became individuals impossible to ignore. Not because they toughened, but because they integrated. Not because they became cold, but because they became sovereign. Not because they stopped feeling, but because they stopped carrying what was never theirs. This is the beginning of the empath's transformation into what Jung called the integrated self, and the road ahead is even more extraordinary. Jung found that once the empath crosses the clarity threshold, a second transformation begins, one far more profound and far more permanent. He called it the collapse of the false self. For years, the empath's identity was shaped by survival. Being agreeable, being accommodating, being emotionally absorbent, being whatever others needed in order to remain loved. But as Jung noted, this wasn't identity, it was adaptation. And adaptations collapse the moment consciousness awakens. Suddenly, the empath notices the cost of their old patterns, how often they betrayed their own intuition, how frequently they tolerated disrespect, how repeatedly they minimized their own hurt, how deeply they shrank themselves to keep the peace. This recognition is not gentle, It arrives like a psychological earthquake. Jung wrote that when a person sees their true shadow, not the darkness of malice but the darkness of self-abandonment, the psyche undergoes an irreversible shift. The empath begins to reclaim the parts of themselves they once pushed down. Their perception, their intelligence, their boundaries, their intuition. These were never weaknesses. They were simply too powerful for the unconscious people around them, who conditioned the empath into believing that their clarity was a flaw. But once the shift happens, the empath cannot go back. Shadow integration begins. This is the moment Jung called shadow integration, the reclaiming of the self that was exiled in order to maintain relationships. The empath's shadow is not aggression or cruelty. The empath's shadow is clarity. It is the brilliance they muted so others would not feel threatened. It is the intuition they ignored so others would not feel exposed. It is the strength they hid because others feared it. When the shadow returns, it comes back as unwavering boundaries, unfiltered intuition, unapologetic truth, unshakable presence. This is why the empath's healed version seems like an entirely different person. Not colder, not harder, but whole. The collapse of manipulation. Jung observed a striking pattern. The moment the empath integrates their shadow, manipulation stops working on them entirely. Gaslighting fails because the empath no longer doubts their perception. Guilt tripping fails because the empath no longer feels responsible for others' emotional chaos. Silent treatment fails because the empath no longer needs external validation. Power plays fail because the empath no longer fears conflict. The psychological hooks that once controlled them no longer exist. The manipulator keeps using the same tactics, but the empath's consciousness has risen above the old pattern. Jung compared it to trying to cast a shadow on someone standing in direct sunlight. The attempt is futile. The predator instinct shifts. Jung made a remarkable observation. Manipulative personalities instinctively sense this shift before the empath speaks a single word. He called it the predator's recoil. Predators avoid prey that can see them. Manipulators avoid people who cannot be deceived. The healed empath radiates an energy that says, I see you fully, and you cannot enter without my permission. This is not arrogance, it is sovereignty. Manipulators feel this as danger. Authentic people feel this as safety. Emotionally mature individuals feel this as respect. Wounded individuals feel this as truth. It is the empath's new psychological frequency, and it is unmistakable. The emergence of the authentic self. For the first time, the empath begins experiencing themselves without distortion. They no longer shape themselves to match the emotional needs of others. They no longer absorb emotions that don't belong to them. They no longer soften their message for the comfort of the unconscious. They begin to live what Jung called life directed by the self, not the persona. The persona, the mask of helpfulness and accommodation, dissolves. What emerges is the true self. Clear, perceptive, unmanipulable, deeply compassionate but never self-sacrificial. Jung believed this was the moment when the empath finally becomes capable of true love. Not codependent love, not rescuing love, not self-erasing love, but conscious love. Love that sees clearly while maintaining boundaries as sacred structure. The attracting field changes. Once the empath reaches this stage, their relationships, and all of them, begin to shift. Jung documented 3 predictable outcomes. 1. Toxic people disappear fast. Not because the empath pushes them away, but because the empath no longer offers the psychological vulnerabilities these people feed on. The relationship collapses under its own weight. 2. Neutral relationships redefine themselves. People either rise to meet the empath's new boundaries or fade into the background. 3. Mature aligned individuals appear seemingly out of nowhere. These individuals were always there, but the empath's old wound kept them invisible. Now the frequency matches. The empath begins attracting people with self-awareness, people with boundaries, people with emotional honesty, people who don't need to be fixed or managed, people who value depth, not dependency. This is the attraction flip Jung described. And here is the shocking part. Jung observed that the transformation is not gradual. It is instantaneous. The moment the core wound heals, the moment the empath trusts their own perception, the relational field reorganizes itself like a shattered mirror reassembling into clarity. The empath steps into a new psychological dimension, and the world rearranges accordingly. Jung discovered that once the empath reaches this level of inner clarity, a second psychological transformation unfolds, one even more disruptive to the old relational patterns. He called it the inversion of projection. For most of their lives, empaths were the projection screens for everyone else's unconsciousness. People projected their pain onto them, their insecurities, their fears, their shadows. And because the empath had porous boundaries, they absorbed it all. But when the empath integrates their shadow and reclaims their perception, the direction of projection reverses. Suddenly, instead of receiving projections, they reflect them back. Not through confrontation, not through revenge, but through the simple fact that they no longer internalize anything that does not belong to them. This reflection is devastating for the unconscious. Because now when someone tries to manipulate the empath, they encounter themselves. When someone gaslights the empath, they hear their own contradictions. When someone blames the empath, the blame ricochets back toward the true source. When someone tries to control the empath, they face their own insecurity. The empath becomes a mirror the unconscious cannot tolerate. And this is where the next phase of Jung's findings emerges. The collapse of manipulative bonds. Manipulative people depend on psychological fog. They rely on confusion. They rely on self-doubt. They rely on emotional absorption. But the healed empath generates none of these conditions. They generate clarity. Clarity is lethal to manipulation. Jung wrote that a person rooted in psychological truth becomes inaccessible to the coercion of shadow-bound personalities. In other words, once you see, you cannot be controlled. And empaths, once healed, see everything. They see the fear behind the anger. They see the insecurity behind the arrogance. They see the fragmented inner child behind the controlling adult. Not with judgment, but with comprehension. And this comprehension dissolves the manipulator's power completely. The reaction of the unconscious. Jung documented 3 predictable reactions manipulators have to the healed empath.
1. They recoil.
Your clarity feels like radiation to someone committed to illusion. 2. They attack. Not because you did anything wrong, but because they cannot tolerate being seen. 3. They retreat. You're no longer usable, so they disappear. Jung emphasized, none of these reactions have anything to do with the empath's worth. They are reactions to the loss of psychological advantage. It is like taking away a predator's ability to hunt. They simply move on. The rise of the integrated empath. Now comes the part Jung found so astonishing that he wrote about it repeatedly. The healed empath becomes capable of a level of emotional and psychological functioning that is rare, powerful, and sometimes unsettling to those around them. They develop what Jung called conscious discrimination of emotional material. which means they feel everything but absorb nothing that isn't theirs. They perceive everything but internalize nothing harmful. They understand everything but are controlled by nothing. Their intuition becomes precise. Their boundaries become sacred. Their emotional responses become grounded. Their perception becomes their compass again, not a burden, but a gift. They no longer love blindly. They no longer attach prematurely. They no longer mistake intensity for intimacy. They no longer seek validation from people unable to offer it. They see clearly and choose consciously. Why people start treating them differently. Jung noticed that once the empath begins living from this integrated state, the world reacts differently. People approach them with respect that was never offered before. Conversations become more honest. Boundary violations stop happening as frequently. Emotional takers feel uneasy around them. Emotionally mature individuals gravitate toward them. It's not magic, it's not aura, it's psychological geometry. The healed empath now occupies relational space differently. They sit upright in their truth. They walk with internal authority. They radiate discernment instead of desperation. And everyone feels it, consciously or not. Jung believed this shift happens because the empath's energy is no longer fragmented. Their internal architecture has reorganized. From fragmentation to sovereignty. Before healing, the empath's psyche operated like this. Intuition without trust. Perception without boundaries. Sensitivity without discernment. Compassion without self-protection. After healing, the architecture becomes intuition with clarity, sensitivity with boundaries, compassion with wisdom, connection with choice. This is what Jung meant by psychic wholeness. The new attraction pattern strengthens. Once the empath embodies this wholeness, Jung observed that their relational life undergoes the most dramatic shift of all. They begin attracting individuals who are also psychologically integrated or actively working toward integration. People who do not fear being seen, do not depend on emotional caretakers, do not weaponize vulnerability, do not exploit kindness, do not collapse under truth. Instead, these people offer reciprocity, depth, consistency, self-awareness, mutual respect, shared growth. This new dynamic is not intense, it is stabilizing, not overwhelming, grounding, not chaotic, elevating. Jung said this was the hallmark of the empath's emergence into psychological adulthood. They stop bonding through dysfunction. They begin bonding through consciousness. And the empath's life begins to change in ways they once believed were impossible. Jung wrote that once the empath reaches this stage, something extraordinary and unsettling begins to happen. He called it the emergence of psychological potency. Before healing, the empath's sensitivity was unstructured. It flowed outward. It accommodated. It absorbed. It softened. It bent. After healing, that same sensitivity becomes structured, focused, sharpened. It becomes power. Not domination, not manipulation, not control, but awareness so precise that other people can feel it in the room. Jung described this state as the dangerous clarity of the conscious individual. Dangerous not because it harms the innocent, but because it dissolves the illusions of those who depend on unconsciousness. Why the healed empath seems dangerous. To someone who lives honestly, the healed empath feels like truth. To someone who lives in self-delusion, the healed empath feels like attack. To someone who values authenticity, the healed empath feels like home. To someone who manipulates, the healed empath feels like exposure. This is why Jung insisted, people do not fear the shadow in others. They fear the shadow it reveals within themselves. A healed empath reveals without trying. They expose without speaking. They clarify without confronting. Their presence alone becomes diagnostic. The empath's new silence. Jung noted something fascinating. Before healing, the empath's silence was submission. After healing, the empath's silence is sovereignty. People feel the difference. The old silence whispered, "Please choose me, please don't leave. Please tell me who I am." The new silence declares, "I choose myself, I see clearly. I walk away when truth requires it." This silence is not passive, it is powerful. It is the silence of someone who no longer needs to defend their perception or justify their boundaries. Jung saw this repeatedly. Manipulators panicked when the healed empath became quiet. Not because they missed the empath's voice, but because they could no longer control the narrative. Silence breaks the spell. The empath becomes psychologically opaque. Before healing, the empath was transparent. Their emotions, fears, and vulnerabilities were visible and exploitable. After healing, they become opaque. Not walled off, but internally anchored. Their emotions have depth, not leakage. Their intuition has direction, not confusion. Their boundaries have structure, not guilt. This opacity is impenetrable to those who once fed on their openness. Manipulators sense they can no longer extract emotional supply. Energy drainers feel starved. Narcissistic personalities feel powerless. Not because the empath fights back, but because the empath no longer participates. Why Jung considered the healed empath a strategic mind? Jung realized something controversial. When an empath integrates their shadow, they gain access to the part of themselves that was suppressed. The perceptive, strategic, razor-sharp intelligence they hid to keep others comfortable. Now it returns fully online. They can detect micro-manipulation instantly, read emotional motives behind every sentence, sense hidden insecurities with uncanny accuracy, predict relational outcomes before they unfold, navigate conflict with calm precision. It is not supernatural. It is psychological mastery, and it makes them impossible to deceive for long. People start saying, "You've changed." Jung said that when a person becomes conscious, the unconscious reacts defensively. People will say, "You're colder. You're different. You're not the same person. You've become distant." But what they truly mean is, "You're no longer controlled by my expectations. You no longer accept my projections. You no longer prioritize my discomfort. You no longer doubt your own truth." The healed empath doesn't change their heart. They change their boundaries. And boundaries feel like hostility to those who benefited from their absence. What the healed empath actually becomes. Jung called the final form of the healed empath a sovereign individual. Someone who feels deeply but chooses consciously, sees clearly but judges slowly, loves generously but not self-destructively, walks away when necessary without collapsing, stands alone without feeling abandoned, connects without losing themselves, offers compassion without offering their sanity. This is not the empath becoming hard. This is the empath becoming whole. Why they attract completely different people. Once this sovereignty takes root, Jung observed a final shift. The relational field reorganizes again. Now the empath attracts people who respect boundaries naturally, communicate honestly, self-reflect without defensiveness, value depth over drama, are capable of mutual growth, are unthreatened by clarity, do not require emotional caretakers. This is the healed empaths tribe, conscious individuals who see sensitivity not as a weakness, but as a form of intelligence. The final paradox Jung identified. Here is the paradox that astonished Jung. The healed empath is the safest person to love and the hardest person to deceive. They become impossible to exploit and irresistible to people who value authenticity. They become a force of psychological order in a world addicted to chaos. They embody what Jung called love with consciousness. Not fantasy, not projection, not self-sacrifice, but love rooted in clarity, depth, boundaries, and sovereignty. The kind of love that heals entire relational systems simply by existing. Jung believed that once an empath reaches sovereignty, a new challenge emerges. Not healing, but maintaining the state they fought so hard to achieve. Because sovereignty isn't a destination, it's a discipline. And Jung observed that even the most awakened individuals can slip back into old patterns if they don't understand the psychological forces still working within them. The first challenge, the echo of the old self. Even after transformation, the empath hears the echo of who they used to be. The part that wants to apologize just to keep peace. The part that wants to explain itself to avoid misunderstanding. The part that wants to soften truth so others won't feel uncomfortable. The part that wants to carry pain that isn't theirs to carry. Jung said this echo is not weakness, it is memory. A memory of survival strategies that once protected the psyche. But the healed empath no longer needs these strategies, and recognizing the echo is the first step to dissolving it. The second challenge, guilt that isn't theirs. Jung documented that healed empaths often experience a peculiar guilt. Not because they've done anything wrong, but because they've finally done something right. They feel guilty for setting boundaries, guilty for telling the truth, guilty for walking away, guilty for choosing themselves. But Jung insisted, guilt is often the price of individuation. Growth feels like abandonment to those who benefited from your stagnation. And the healed empath must learn to distinguish authentic responsibility from implanted guilt. One heals, the other enslaves. The third challenge, the temptation to save. Even after gaining sovereignty, the empath's oldest instinct remains. The compulsion to fix, soothe, guide, rescue. Jung warned, the greatest danger for the awakened individual is the temptation to become a savior. Because saving others is just another way of avoiding one's own inner work. Now the empath must learn a higher skill. Compassion without interference, love without rescue, care without self-erasure. In Jung's terms, to be with others without becoming for them. The fourth challenge, the return of manipulators. Jung discovered something eerie. When an empath becomes sovereign, manipulators return one last time. Not because they want connection, but because they want access. They sense something has changed. They sense they have lost control. They sense the source of emotional supply has closed. So they test the boundaries. A text from the past, a sudden apology, a nostalgic memory, a quick favor, a disguised compliment, a manufactured crisis. Jung called this phenomenon the final projection test. If the empath passes it, the manipulator's influence dissolves permanently. If the empath fails, the old cycles return with even greater psychological cost. The healed empath responds with calm clarity, not anger. I'm not available for this dynamic anymore. And the spell breaks for good. The fifth challenge, loneliness that comes before alignment. Jung noted that every sovereign empath enters a period he called the sacred loneliness. Not isolation, not depression, but the emptiness that occurs when the old tribe no longer fits and the new tribe has not yet arrived. This loneliness is initiation. The psyche is reorganizing. Your energetic signature is changing. Your relational field is clearing. Jung insisted, "The emptiness you feel is not the absence of connection, but the preparation for right connection." This period teaches the empath the last great lesson. They no longer choose relationships based on need, but based on conscious compatibility. The final emergence, the sovereign empath. Jung described the fully integrated empath with striking clarity. An individual who has made peace with their depth and set boundaries around their light. They are no longer shaped by the world around them. They begin shaping the world within them. They inspire others, not through advice but through presence. They awaken others, and not by pointing out patterns but by embodying clarity. They attract the right people, not through effort but through resonance. They repel manipulators, not through defense but through transparency. They live without pretending, they love without losing themselves, they see without collapsing. They feel without drowning. They choose without guilt. They are, in Jung's words, a completed personality, one who has returned to themselves. And here is Jung's final revelation. Empaths do not become powerful by healing their sensitivity. They become powerful by healing the world's distortion of it. Their sensitivity was never the wound. The world's discomfort with it was. Once the empath stops abandoning their perception, once they stop apologizing for their intelligence, once they stop silencing their intuition, they become the one thing Jung believed could elevate human consciousness. A person who sees clearly and still chooses compassion. A person who feels deeply and still chooses boundaries. A person who walks alone and still chooses love. A person who is no longer controlled by the unconscious of others. A sovereign empath. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark. One awakened mind helping another remember. Together, we move beyond the dark.